Long ago, Tom Clancy's Rainbow Six Siege used to be a tactical shooter with lore that grounded it in reality. Countries around the world creating an organization to fight back against terrorism seemed like something that could actually be real, and each operator and faction represented their country of origin with proper kit to match. And while everything definitely wasn't perfect, many considered Siege to be one of the most realistic comp shooters on the market. However, as the game has evolved, it has become more and more disconnected from that original vision of a down-to-earth, gritty competitive shooter, through its changes in gameplay, its choices in its new operators, and in the evolution of its lore. And while many of you may point out that this doesn't affect gameplay whatsoever, it's still an opinion of mine, and clearly many others, that affects our perception of new content and the game's direction. Siege's rapid change in its tonal direction has undoubtedly pushed many of the game's initial players away and onto other titles. So follow me as I tell the story of how Siege completely lost its identity. Rainbow Six Siege's gritty and realistic tone began all the way back before the game even released with its marketing. I'm sure if you have played Siege before, you have likely seen the game's 2014 E3 trailers. These trailers were portrayed as gameplay, and it showed the attackers rappelling onto the map from a helicopter, breaching into the building, and attempting to rescue the hostage. As they get into gunfights with the terrorists, walls are getting obliterated and they eventually begin breaching surfaces, which shows off the game's deep destruction. Even though this obviously isn't exactly how the game released, it still shows how Ubisoft was wanting to portray and market this game. Every character on both sides was decked out in realistic gear, the gunfights and destruction looked extremely impressive, and the graphical fidelity helped to sell that gritty atmosphere they were going for. Ubisoft would follow this up with an additional trailer on the white mask terrorist threat that players would be going up against in Siege. This trailer would come at Ubisoft's 2015 E3 press conference, 1 year after the initial gameplay trailer. These cinematics show off Aurelia Arnott, codenamed Six, and the active director of Team Rainbow speaking about the growing global terroristic threat, the white masks. She discusses how Team Rainbow has been reactivated since they have no choice but to meet force with force. Both of these trailers were clearly trying to hit home with the Tom Clancy series audience, which was mostly fans of tactical shooters. And once the game was released, it would launch with cinematics of each operator showing off their gadgets and their personalities, which would continue to fit into this image that Ubisoft was trying to portray Siege as. Now, I want you to look at this marketing and compare it to the more recent Year 8 and Year 9 cinematics to advertise new content updates. The Year 8 cinematic looks like an action movie, and it has none of that grittiness or realism that the game's original trailers and cinematics portrayed. You have Caveira doing acrobats and the rest of the gang running around like it's a John Wick film. Then at the end of the trailer, they show Deimos, who has been built up as a Marvel-esque villain, killing Harry, who was the active director of Team Rainbow at the time. This cinematic and others throughout Year 8 build up to Year 9's reveal where Tom Clancy finally faced Deimos directly and capture him. Now, what I will say about this is that Deimos is an incredibly well-written character. He is probably the only saving grace of Siege's lore right now, which I'll go more in depth on later in this video. But I'm sure you can see the stark difference in the game's marketing and trailers between modern day and its initial marketing for its first few years. The core push is completely different. Siege's marketing now seems more like something you'd see from a hero shooter like Overwatch or Valorant, while its original marketing felt unique and refreshing. And a drastic shift in marketing like this could be expected from a game that has been alive for 9 years if the game had changed significantly. However, I would argue that not even Ubisoft knows what they want to do with the game. And currently, I don't think this massive shift in marketing fits the tone of the game. Now, when Siege was first released, the game was immersive, it actually felt like a tactical shooter, and it looked nothing like the game does today. Just look at these two images side by side. They don't even look or feel like the same game. This can also be seen in even something as simple as the main menu of the game, where new operators in the early days had a serious tone, and now the menu is extremely bright and tone deaf. However, as the years went on and people played more and more, players began to realize that the gameplay was extremely aggressive. Insanely fast movement, ADS speeds being quicker than ever before, guns having little to no recoil, and mechanics like bolo leaning made it possible for players at the highest level to play extremely fast, without playing the game tactically as the developers originally intended with the game's vision. As players began to discover these deep mechanics, Ubisoft began to fight back with balancing change after balancing change after balancing change. And from a balancing perspective, it seemed like Ubisoft wanted the game to still uphold its tactical shooter foundation. Because after a lot of these changes, I would argue that the game at its core is actually more similar to a tactical shooter than it has ever been. The game is objectively slower and the gunplay is way more difficult to master. But this is what makes the game feel so lost. Ubisoft continues to try and steer the direction of the game into a slower paced shooter that is more tactical in nature. But they are doing this while trying to distance themselves from the original controversial marketing and lore of the game that they have been building up for years. Removing Terrorist Hunt and avoiding the topic of terrorists and lore, removing Bartlett U simply for it being a university, and and releasing new operators that no longer have any attachment to their country or origins are just a few examples of this. The operator part is especially damning. I remember when new seasons came out in the first few years of the game's content updates, people were excited about their country being represented because Ubisoft would do the research to ensure they portrayed law enforcement from these regions accurately. Their weapons were either produced in the country they were from, or they were used by that country's military or law enforcement extensively. And everything down to even their uniforms had designs with realism in mind. Compare this to an operator like Fenrir, who is a Swedish and relatively new operator to Siege, whose uniform doesn't match anything you'd expect from a Swedish law enforcement officer, military, or special forces, and who only has one region accurate weapon. I think you see why people no longer care about the region of an operator, because it no longer has any real effect on the operator's design as a whole. All of these choices combined make Siege feel like a game who has completely lost its identity. The game on release was marketed and played like a tactical shooter. In the middle of its lifespan, it played like a casual shooter, but was still marketed as a tactical shooter. And then today, it plays more like a tactical shooter than ever before, while being marketed like a hero shooter. So it's almost like Ubisoft has no idea what they want the game to be, and its confusing identity continues into the game's lore. Now, the lore of Siege has always been a controversial topic, and it definitely isn't the biggest contributor to the game's complete lack of an identity, because most players of Siege couldn't care less about the game's lore. They just want to play a competitive shooter and grind the ranks. But the game's lore definitely contributes to the problem to a certain degree. If you want to watch a video explaining why Siege's lore is so problematic, Lufa made a video explaining the intricate details of this issue, but I'm mainly focused on how this contributes to the game feeling tone deaf, so I won't be going too in depth into the intricacies of the game's lore. I'll just be going through the main story points to keep it brief. As I mentioned earlier, Siege's early lore was entirely founded on the idea that Team Rainbow was a global organization designed to fight terrorism. The lore's entire premise was around fighting the White Masks, and while this did give the game a more grounded and realistic tone, it really wasn't enough to chew on for very long. But because Ubisoft was focused on growing and fixing the game's broken launch, they didn't really build on the lore much for many years. There weren't ever any new single-player missions, new terrorist organizations were never founded, and the game's lore just kind of stagnated until the beginning of 2019, where the game's lore would take a huge tonal shift, and the game as a whole would follow suit in what felt like overnight. This is because at the beginning of 2019, after defeating the White Masks, the director of Team Rainbow would be given a promotion, and a new director would be assigned by the name of Harry. Harry would immediately begin his time as director by starting an initiative called the Program. The goal of this program was to make Team Rainbow better prepared to deploy quickly around the world by building more facilities and decentralizing Team Rainbow. He would also spend some of Team Rainbow's budget on hiring a private military group called Nighthaven to train and operate alongside Team Rainbow. And this would mark the beginning of a chapter in the game's lore that was objectively awful, because Harry would then start something called the Tournament of Champions. This was an open to the public training exercise that was meant to explain the events of the gameplay in the lore. And the dates of these tournaments were always held at the same time of the 6th Invitational in real life. These tournaments, combined with the new organization in the form of Nighthaven, marked the beginning of the lore being less about a global effort between countries and more about our individual operators. Drama amongst our operators was at the forefront, and it really did feel like Ubisoft was trying to replicate what other popular shooters were doing, like Apex. And like I said, this came basically overnight, since up until 2019, the lore was on the back burner, and Ubisoft was not focusing pretty much any of their efforts towards it. And up until this point, the game's lore was as simple as a bunch of law enforcement organizations working together to fight terrorists. But continuing down this path, tensions would begin to build between Team Rainbow and Nighthaven, until Nighthaven would eventually leave Team Rainbow, bringing some of our operators with them. However, shortly after their departure, Azami and the businessman she was tasked with protecting by the name of Yahata were attacked, resulting in the death of Yahata. While investigating, Azami would find a bullet casing that came from Nighthaven's QCR department. And now Team Rainbow's top priority was to investigate what was going on at Nighthaven. Team Rainbow then does an operation where they infiltrate Nighthaven's headquarters and acquire an important data key that can give them the answers they need. And this is the kind of lore that we would see for a long time, where Team Rainbow and Nighthaven would be at constant odds with each other, and the lore would be entirely based around this conflict. However, due to the story point in the lore being so bad, Ubisoft would write over this conflict by later revealing in 2023 that Deimos had set up the whole conflict between Nighthaven and Rainbow because he felt that Team Rainbow is a shadow of what it used to be. Basically, Deimos is the embodiment of all the haters of the Siege lore in-game, and he's their attempt to take the lore in a different direction by building a bond between the operators in Rainbow and Nighthaven once again, since they have now come to grips with the fact that the reasons they hated each other were almost entirely manufactured. But the worst part about the lore, and the reason why I think it's a detriment, is because there are no stakes in it. Throughout the game's entire 9-year life cycle, not a single operator has died, and the only important character death was Harry, who Deimos killed in his office. Even in the later conflict between Deimos and Rainbow, where Doc was shot in the head by Deimos, Mira was shot in the shoulder, and Rook was shot in the chest, not a single one of them died or were even seriously injured. It feels like every operator in the lore has plot armor, and Ubisoft are just trying to keep the ball rolling without anything actually happening. But I'm sure you can see how jarring this lore direction is in comparison to what I mentioned earlier at the start of the game. Obviously, I oversimplified a lot of the lore for the sake of brevity, but there are multiple obvious major shifts in tone in the game's lore in its key moments. From a global organization focused on anti-terror, to drama amongst that organization and televised training events causing it to splinter, to more recently the target of Rainbow being a single Marvel-esque villain in the form of Deimos. It's just an absolute disaster that doesn't help the game feel like it has any real identity. And the final way Siege has lost its identity is in its cosmetics. As I've mentioned throughout this video, Siege started by initially trying to uphold the uniforms of the units the operators were a part of, and the game tried to keep a somewhat serious tone to their skins. New elites were designed off of older military or law enforcement uniforms, and other skins like Pro League skins weren't too terribly off base either. They were mostly just recolors of the already existing uniforms. However, as the game has evolved, Siege has been getting more and more lenient with their skin design, starting off with brighter colors and less serious designs, and slowly building up to full-blown crossovers like the 2B Iana skin and the Master Chief Sledge skin. These skins are extremely well done, and they match the characters they are based off of. I'm not saying they are bad skins by any means, but do we really think that these skins fit into the original vision of the game? Do you think that we really need Rick and Morty running around while playing a game that is still classified as a tactical shooter on most storefronts, in Ubisoft's own words? I personally don't believe so, and that's basically what this whole video is, personal opinion. At its core, none of what I have mentioned affects the gameplay, and that is the most important part of any comp shooter. But all of these little things add up to make the game feel hugely disconnected, and Siege just hasn't felt the same since its huge tonal direction. In conclusion, Siege started out as a shooter that was advertised heavily to the tactical shooter audience as a gritty and grounded experience in all areas. But as the game has evolved, Ubisoft has balanced the game in a way to lean more into the tactical shooter mechanics while demolishing the original lore, removing a lot of the characters of new content updates, and releasing tone-deaf cosmetics in an attempt to get the best of both worlds. Hold on to the tactical shooter label and keep those players while pushing the game to the hero shooter crowd as well. But this ends up with the game feeling completely confused, with the original vision being tainted and the game's identity all but lost. Will Siege form a new identity for itself in the hero shooter space, or will it try to uphold the original veneer of a tactical shooter it did all those years ago? I have no idea. All I know is that right now it's doing neither very well. Anyways, hopefully you guys enjoyed today's video covering how Siege lost its identity. Let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. I'd love to hear from you. If you did enjoy today's video, I make Siege content just like this twice a week, so go subscribe to the channel and follow me on Twitter if you don't want to miss the next upload. Now, if you want to watch another video just like this one, a video will be popping up on your screen right now that I'm sure you all enjoy. I'll see you next time, friends, and peace.